A scream echoes through the town square. Not the scream of death, that would be merciful. This is the scream of a man watching his own hand being slowly, methodically destroyed. Bone by bone, joint by joint. The crowd doesn't look away. They lean in closer. Medieval Europe had 1,000 ways to punish a thief, but only one that made sure you'd never forget. Not just because of the pain, though the pain was unimaginable, but because afterward, everyone would know what you'd done. Your mangled hand would tell the story for the rest of your life. If you're fascinated by these dark corners of history, leave a like and subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach across the world. The device was deceptively simple. 2 iron plates connected by a screw mechanism. It looked almost mundane sitting there on the executioner's table, like a tool from a blacksmith's workshop. That simplicity was the cruelest part, because what it did to human flesh and bone was anything but simple. They called it many things across Europe. The hand press, the finger pillory, die Daumenschraube in German lands. In France, they called it le brise-main, the handbreaker. Each region had its own name, but the function remained identical. A universal language of suffering that crossed borders and spoke to every potential thief in terms they couldn't misunderstand. The condemned would be dragged to the platform. Sometimes it was market day, when the crowds were thick and the message would spread furthest. Other times it was Sunday after church, when the entire community would gather, fresh from prayer, ready to witness earthly justice. The executioner, often a man who'd inherited the position from his father, a family business of suffering, would force the thief's hand between the plates. These executioners were professionals. They lived in special houses, usually on the outskirts of town, because their profession made them simultaneously essential and untouchable. No one wanted to share a meal with the man who crushed bones for a living, yet everyone needed him. He was paid well, sometimes better than the town baker or blacksmith. His services were always in demand. Then the turning began. First, you'd feel pressure, uncomfortable, but bearable. The kind of sensation that makes you instinctively want to pull away, but the guards holding your arms made sure that wasn't an option. You'd look at the executioner, maybe try to plead, but he'd seen thousands of faces, heard every plea imaginable. His expression never changed. This was his job. The screw turned. The small bones in your hand, 27 of them, each designed to give you the dexterity that separates humans from beasts, began to compress. The metacarpals, those long bones in your palm, were the first to crack, not a clean break like falling from a horse. A splintering, a slow fracture that sent shockwaves of agony up your arm and into your shoulder. Your body would try to jerk away, but the guards held firm. The crowd would be completely silent now. That initial murmur of conversation would die. People who'd been gossiping moments before now stood transfixed. Children would be lifted onto their father's shoulders for a better view. This was education. This was entertainment. This was justice. The phalanges, your finger bones, came next. These smaller, more delicate structures didn't just break, they shattered. Fragment against fragment, grinding like gravel under a wagon wheel. Cartilage tore. Ligaments snapped like wet rope. The executioner would pause occasionally, checking the screw's progress, ensuring the destruction was thorough but not too quick. Because speed defeated the purpose. This needed to last. The victim needed to feel every stage of their hand's destruction. The crowd needed to watch every moment. Terror only works when it's drawn out, when imaginations have time to put themselves in that position, to feel phantom pains in their own hands. Your hand transformed into something unrecognizable, a purple, swollen mass that looked more like spoiled meat than human anatomy. Blood pooled under the skin, unable to escape, turning your flesh into a grotesque bruise that spread up your wrist. Nerve endings transmitted only one message: unbearable, all-consuming pain that made thinking impossible, that reduced you to a howling animal. Some people vomited from the pain, others bit through their own tongues, adding fresh blood to the spectacle. A few passed out entirely, and buckets of cold water would be thrown in their faces. You didn't get to escape into unconsciousness. That mercy was denied. The crowd watched with a strange mixture of horror and satisfaction. These weren't sadists, most of them. They were ordinary people who'd had their own possessions stolen, who lived one bad harvest away from starvation, who believed that order must be maintained at any cost, the baker whose week's earnings were stolen, the merchant who'd been robbed on the road, the farmer who'd lost chickens to night thieves. They all nodded as the screw turned. Good. Right. Deserved. But there were also children in that crowd who'd never forget what they saw, who'd have nightmares for years about the sound of bones cracking, who'd grow up terrified to even touch someone else's property, even accidentally. The psychological scarring extended far beyond the victim on the platform. When the screw finally reached its limit, when the executioner decided enough damage had been done, the plates would be opened. What emerged was barely recognizable as a hand. Bones crushed into fragments so small they'd never heal properly. Fingers bent at impossible angles. The skin split in places, showing white bone splinters pushing through purple flesh. A doctor would sometimes be present, not to help, but to ensure the victim wouldn't die immediately. Infection was expected. This was an era. Before antibiotics, before germ theory, before anyone understood why wounds festered. But immediate death from shock or blood loss, that defeated the purpose. You were meant to survive and carry your punishment visibly for the rest of your days. The hand would be roughly bandaged, though often with dirty cloth that guaranteed infection. Then you'd be thrown into a cell for a few days, giving the initial swelling time to set in, letting the pain evolve from acute agony to chronic bone-deep suffering. When you were finally released, your hand would be locked in that crushed position, fingers frozen, palm unable to close or open, completely useless. You wouldn't hold a tool, wouldn't grip a weapon, wouldn't even feed yourself properly. Every meal became a humiliating struggle. Getting dressed took hours. And winter, when you couldn't properly grip firewood or wrap yourself in a cloak. Many victims of the hand press died within their first winter, not from the injury itself, but from their inability to care for themselves in harsh conditions. Your destroyed hand became your permanent criminal record, written in scar tissue and crooked bones. Every shopkeeper who saw you would know. Every employer would turn you away. Every potential marriage prospect would look elsewhere. Children would point and their mothers would use you as a cautionary tale. See that man? That's what happens to thieves. You became a living warning that walked through the marketplace, a breathing reminder of what awaited anyone who stepped outside the law. In a society without photographs, without identification cards, without criminal databases, your body became the record. Justice was written on your flesh. But the hand press was just one instrument in a vast orchestra of suffering designed specifically for thieves. In London, they favoured the pillory for pickpockets and minor thieves. Your head and hands would be locked in wooden boards, standing in the market for hours or even days while the crowd pelted you with whatever they could find. Rotten vegetables sound almost comical until you realise a cabbage thrown hard enough could break your nose. Rotten eggs carried diseases, and then there were the people who threw rocks. Records from Old Bailey tell us about Thomas Brewster, a pickpocket who spent 3 hours in the pillory in 1731. By the time they released him, he'd lost 4 teeth, his nose was broken, and one eye was swollen completely shut. He died 2 weeks later from an infection that started in the lacerations covering his face. The crowd had been particularly enthusiastic that day. His crime, stealing a handkerchief worth 3 shillings. The pillory killed in other ways too. The crowd could press forward, crushing victims against the wooden structure. Suffocation wasn't uncommon. In 1756, a crowd in London became so frenzied while pelting a convicted fraud that they pushed forward en masse. 4 people in the pillory died simply from being unable to breathe as hundreds of bodies pressed against the platform. One thief in 1732 had his eye knocked out by a frozen turnip. Another lost an ear when someone threw a piece of brick. The authorities didn't intervene. This was considered part of the punishment. The crowd's rage was seen as an extension of justice itself, a democratic participation in the enforcement of law. The pillory had a particular cruelty beyond the physical. You were completely helpless. Couldn't wipe your own face when blood ran into your eyes. Couldn't shield yourself from projectiles. Couldn't even turn your head away. Just had to stand there and take it, hour after hour, while the crowd's creativity in finding things to throw was given free rein. The Germans had a particular fondness for the cat's paw. A metal rake dragged down the thief's back, tearing through skin and muscle until you could see ribs. The instrument looked like a large hand with 4 or 5 curved metal claws, each sharpened to a point. The victim would be tied to a post in the town square, shirt removed, arms stretched above their head, and bound. The executioner would start at the shoulder blade. The claws would dig into flesh, then pull downward with steady pressure. Skin parted like fabric. Muscle tore in long strips. The sound was apparently distinctive, a wet, ripping noise that made spectators queasy even as they watched. The executioner would make 4 parallel paths down the back, from shoulders to waist, creating a pattern of destruction. But they couldn't go too deep. Hit an artery, and the thief would bleed out in minutes. The goal was to destroy the flesh while leaving vital structures intact. It required skill, a thorough understanding of human anatomy learned through repeated practice. The best executioners could flay a back so thoroughly that you could see the muscles moving beneath, yet the victim would survive. The wounds would be cauterized with hot iron to prevent immediate death from blood loss. The smell of burning flesh would fill the square. The victim would pass out from the pain, be revived, and pass out again. This cycle would repeat until the cauterization was complete. Then they'd be thrown in a cell to either die from infection or somehow survive. Those who survived carried the scars forever. Your back would be a mass of twisted tissue, making it impossible to lie flat or wear rough clothing. Every movement pulled at damaged muscle, and everyone who saw your back knew exactly what you'd done. In France, they burned Thieves with a fleur-de-lis brand on the shoulder. The metal would be heated in a brazier until it glowed orange, hot enough that you could feel the heat radiating from it when it came near your skin. Then it would be pressed into flesh until it sizzled and smoked. The smell of burning meat would hang in the air long after the branding was done. The brand was large, 3 inches across, impossible to miss. It burned through several layers of skin, creating a permanent mark that would never fade. Some victims would try to cover it later with clothing, but the brand was deliberately placed where it would be visible in most common garments of the era. The pain of the branding itself lasted only seconds. The iron would be applied and removed quickly, but the aftermath was worse. The burn would weep and ooze for weeks. Infection was almost guaranteed. Fever would set in. Many branded criminals died within a month, their bodies unable to fight off the infection from the deliberately inflicted wound. Those who survived found themselves marked forever. Bathhouses would refuse entry. No one wanted to share water with a convicted criminal. Inns would turn you away. If you were a woman, marriage prospects vanished entirely. The brand followed you everywhere, a scarlet letter burned into your flesh that you could never remove or hide completely. Some desperate souls tried to remove the brand themselves. They'd cut away the scarred flesh with knives, creating wounds that inevitably became infected and often killed them. Others would try to burn over it, creating a worse scar in hopes of obscuring the fleur-de-lis pattern. It never worked. The original brand was always visible underneath, and now you had additional mutilation to mark you further. Italian city-states preferred amputation for repeat offenders. First theft, branding. Second theft, the hand comes off, not with a press, but with an axe on a chopping block, the same block used for cutting wood and breaking apart pig carcasses in the market. The executioner would force your arm down, hand flat on the blood-stained wood. An assistant would hold your arm in place, then one clean swing of the axe aimed at the wrist joint where the bones would separate more easily. If the executioner was skilled, your hand would come off in a single blow. If not, it might take 2 or 3 strikes, each one sending fresh waves of agony through your body. The stump would be immediately plunged into boiling tar to seal it. The sound of your own flesh burning, the smell of it, while you screamed and thrashed and begged for death. But death wasn't on offer. You'd live, assuming you survived the shock and subsequent infection, with a tarred stump where your hand used to be. At least the hand press left you with something resembling a hand, even if it didn't work. The Italians believed in absolute removal. Can't steal if you have no hands at all. They had a practical, almost mathematical approach to justice. The punishment precisely countered the crime. Used your hands to steal, lose your hands. Some repeat offenders in Venice lost both hands. They'd become beggars, holding up their stumps for coins, living reminders of what happened when you didn't learn your lesson the first time. The city fathers considered this good policy. These human wreckage served as mobile warnings, far more effective than any posted notice. The Venetian records are particularly detailed. They list names, crimes, dates of amputation. A man named Giacomo lost his right hand in 1492 for stealing silver candlesticks from a church. He was caught stealing again in 1494, this time food from a market stall. His left hand was taken. He died in 1495, found frozen in an alley during winter, unable to beg effectively with no hands to hold out. Some regions would nail a thief's ear to a wooden post in the market square. You'd stand there for a full day, unable to move your head without tearing your own flesh. The nail would go through the cartilage of your ear, into the post behind you. Your neck would cramp. Your legs would shake from standing. The sun would beat down or rain would soak you, but you couldn't move. People would walk past, going about their daily business. Some would spit at you. Others would stop and lecture you about morality. Children would poke at you with sticks. And all the while, that nail held you in place, a single point of piercing pain that never diminished. When the day ended, you had two choices. Some victims would tear themselves free in a sudden burst of desperate courage. They'd jerk their head forward, ripping the ear partially off, leaving a ragged tear that would heal into a mangled mess. Others would wait for the executioner to cut them loose, and he'd often take the entire ear while he was at it. Either way, you'd be marked. A missing or torn ear told everyone who saw you that you'd been convicted of theft. The Spanish Inquisition, because of course they had opinions on theft too, used the strappado for thieves who stole from the church. Church property was considered especially sacred, so the punishment escalated accordingly. Your hands would be tied behind your back, rope attached to your wrists, then you'd be hoisted into the air by a pulley system, your full body weight hanging from your arms wrenched behind you. Shoulders dislocated with a pop that spectators could hear across the room. The pain was instant and overwhelming. Your arms felt like they were being torn from your body. Breathing became difficult because the position compressed your chest. Sometimes they'd drop you suddenly, stopping just before you hit the ground. The jerk would tear ligaments, separate joints further, damage nerves. Your screams would echo through the chamber. They might lift you and drop you multiple times, each impact causing new damage. When they finally lowered you, your arms would hang useless. You couldn't lift them above your waist, couldn't dress yourself, couldn't work. The damage was often permanent. Your shoulders would heal in a dislocated position, creating a distinctive posture that marked you as clearly as any brand. For horse thieves, the punishment escalated dramatically. Horses were wealth, transportation, military assets. They were worth more than most people earned in a year. Stealing a horse wasn't just theft, it was almost treason, a crime against the social and economic order itself. In England, horse thieves were hanged, but not the quick drop that breaks your neck cleanly. That was considered too merciful. Instead, it was slow strangulation. You'd be placed in a cart beneath a gallows, the noose around your neck. Then the cart would be driven away, leaving you dangling. Your feet would kick frantically, searching for ground that wasn't there. Your hands, usually tied, would sometimes be left free specifically so the crowd could watch you claw at the rope around your neck. Your face would turn red, then purple. Your eyes would bulge. Your tongue would swell and protrude from your mouth, and this would go on for minutes, 5, 10, sometimes 15 if you were young and strong. The crowd would watch every second. Some would place bets on how long you'd last. Others would count the kicks, the spasms. Children would mimic your death throes later, playing gallows in the street. Your death became community entertainment and education simultaneously. The body would be left hanging for weeks as a warning. It would bloat in the sun. Birds would peck at it. The smell would become unbearable, but no one would cut it down until the authorities decided the message had been sufficiently broadcast. Sometimes bodies hung until they fell apart, pieces dropping into the mud below the gallows. In some regions, they'd hang the body in chains, a metal cage that held the corpse together even as it decomposed. These gibbets would stand at crossroads or on hilltops, visible for miles. The message was clear. This is what happens to horse thieves. The caged skeleton would rattle in the wind, a permanent monument to the consequences of crime. But here's the thing about medieval justice that makes all of this even more horrifying than the tortures themselves. Speed was valued over accuracy. A merchant points at a beggar, says, "That man stole my purse," and within hours that beggar's hand is in the press. No investigation, no witnesses beyond the accuser, no defense attorney, no presumption of innocence, no appeal process. The wealthy merchant's word against a poor man's denial. Guess who the court believes every single time? The legal system was structured to favour the accuser, especially if they had money or status. A trial could take less than an hour. The judge would hear the accusation, maybe ask the accused if they denied it, then make a ruling. If you were poor, if you were a stranger in town, if you had no one to vouch for your character, you were almost certainly going to be convicted regardless of actual guilt. Records from medieval German towns tell us about Hans the Miller, accused of stealing grain in 1487. A wealthy landowner claimed Hans had taken 3 sacks from his storehouse. Hans insisted he was innocent, that he'd bought the grain legally from a trader, but he had no receipt, no witnesses. The landowner had both status and certainty. Hans's hand was crushed in the press on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday he was back home, cradling his mangled hand, trying to figure out how to operate his mill with one functioning hand. 2 weeks later, the actual thief was caught with stolen grain still in his possession. He confessed to stealing from the landowner, described exactly how he'd done it. The authorities were informed, they arrested the real thief. And Hans? He received no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement that a terrible mistake had been made. The official response, according to the town records, was essentially unfortunate, but the process was followed correctly. As if following an unjust process correctly somehow made the outcome acceptable. Hans couldn't work his mill anymore. Milling required 2 strong hands, one to guide the grain, one to adjust the stones. Within a year, he'd lost his business. Within 2 years, he was begging on the streets. He died 3 years after his false conviction, found frozen in a ditch during winter, all because a wealthy man made a mistake and the system had no mechanism for correcting it. In 1532, a woman named Catherine was branded as a thief in Lyon. A merchant claimed she'd stolen silk from his shop. Catherine was a seamstress who worked in the same market. She denied the accusation vehemently, explained that she'd bought silk from him just that week, that he must have confused her with someone else. But the merchant was adamant. He recognized her face, he said. She was the thief. The brand burned into her shoulder. The fleur-de-lis marked her permanently. Her life collapsed immediately. Customers stopped coming. No one wanted clothing made by a convicted thief. Her landlord evicted her. Her friends abandoned her. She spent 3 years unemployable, unmarriable, permanently marked as a criminal. Then, in 1535, another woman was caught stealing from the same merchant's shop. This woman confessed not only to this theft, but to several others, including the one Catherine had been blamed for. She described the crime in detail, details that matched what actually happened, details Catherine couldn't have known because she wasn't there. The authorities were informed. They questioned the real thief. She confirmed Catherine's innocence. And what did Catherine receive? An unfortunate mistake was entered into the record. Nothing more. No compensation for 3 years of hell. No removal of the brand, that was impossible. No public acknowledgement of her innocence. Just a quiet note in a ledger that most people would never see. Catherine's life never recovered. The brand remained. Even people who learned she was innocent still saw the mark and remembered the accusation. She ended up working in a brothel, the only place that would hire a branded woman. She died at 31, just 6 years after being branded from disease. Her gravestone, if she had one, probably didn't mention that she'd been innocent all along. These weren't isolated incidents. Town records across Europe are full of similar cases, and those are just the ones that were documented. How many innocents were crushed, branded, hanged, and mutilated whose innocence was never discovered? How many real criminals got away while innocent people paid for their crimes? The irony cuts deeper than any blade. These punishments were called justice. They were performed in the name of order, righteousness, godly law. The executioner would often say a prayer before turning the screw, asking God to guide his hand in this holy work of punishment. The crowd would cross themselves and murmur Amen as the victim screamed. But divine judgment doesn't make mistakes. Human judgment does, constantly, predictably, systematically. A jealous neighbour makes an accusation to get revenge for some petty slight. A confused witness identifies the wrong person. People all look similar in poor lighting in crowds when you're frightened. A corrupt magistrate accepts a bribe to convict an innocent man while letting the guilty go free. The machinery of justice grinds forward regardless, crushing the innocent and guilty with equal efficiency. The hand press doesn't care if you're guilty. It crushes bone all the same. The brand burns just as hot on innocent flesh. The gallows rope strangles the wrongly accused just as effectively as it does the actual criminal. The tools of justice are indifferent. They perform their function without moral judgment. The torture itself was considered justice in their eyes. If you were truly innocent, God would intervene. He'd stop the screw from turning, or give you the strength to endure without screaming. Medieval logic was circular and cruel. If you suffered, you must have deserved it. If you were innocent, you wouldn't suffer. Therefore, anyone who suffers must be guilty. Trial by ordeal operated on this same principle. Hold a red-hot iron and walk 3 paces. If your hand heals cleanly, you're innocent. If it festers, you're guilty. Never mind that all burns fester without proper medical treatment. The system was designed to produce guilty verdicts almost automatically. They tortured for justice but created only more injustice. Every wrongful conviction, every false accusation, every innocent person marked and maimed, it all happened under the banner of law and order. The same crowds who demanded harsh punishment for thieves never considered they might be cheering for the destruction of an innocent person. Some thieves deserved punishment, perhaps. The ones who stole from the starving, who took the last coins from widows, who made hard lives harder. But mixed among them were the desperate, the falsely accused, the victims of mistaken identity. The hand press crushed them all with equal efficiency. A baker's apprentice accused of stealing bread to feed his siblings while his master underpaid him. A servant blamed for her master's missing jewellery when the master had simply misplaced it and was too proud to admit his mistake. A traveller who looked similar to a known thief, identified by witnesses who saw the crime in darkness from 30 paces away and were absolutely certain despite the physical impossibility of making that identification accurately. Medieval justice was a blunt instrument wielded with absolute confidence and zero room for doubt. Once the accusation was made, the outcome was nearly inevitable. The very existence of these torture devices created pressure to use them. What magistrate wants to appear soft on crime? What town wants a reputation for leniency that might attract criminals? So the screws turned, the brands burned, the axes fell, and among the guilty, an unknowable number of innocent people screamed just as loudly, bled just as freely, and carried the marks of crimes they never committed until the day they died. There are records from a trial in 1445 in Nuremberg. A man named Friedrich was accused of stealing from his employer, a wealthy goldsmith. Friedrich denied it. He'd worked for this goldsmith for 7 years without incident. He had a wife and 3 children. He was known in the community as honest and reliable, but the goldsmith's son testified against him, said he saw Friedrich take the gold with his own eyes. The son was believed. He was wealthy, educated, well-spoken. Friedrich was just a worker, his word worth less. Friedrich's hand went into the press. 15 years later, the goldsmith's son, now an old man on his deathbed, confessed. He'd stolen the gold himself and blamed Friedrich to avoid punishment. He'd lived with the guilt for 15 years while Friedrich lived without his livelihood, his reputation, or the use of his hand. The authorities recorded the confession. Friedrich was officially pardoned, but he'd been dead for 8 years by then, having died in poverty, still marked as a thief in everyone's eyes. His children grew up as the children of a convicted criminal, their prospects diminished, their lives made harder, all because a rich man's son lied, and the system believed money over honesty. That's the true horror. Not just the devices themselves, but the certainty with which they were applied. The absolute conviction that this was right, this was necessary, this was justice. The system had no mechanism for doubt. Ambiguity was not permitted. You were guilty or innocent, and if you were accused, the evidence almost always pointed toward guilty. The wealthy could sometimes buy their way out. A large enough bribe to the right magistrate could make charges disappear. Or they could afford character witnesses, people of standing who would vouch for them. The poor had neither option. Their innocence or guilt was almost irrelevant. Their poverty made them vulnerable, and the system exploited that vulnerability ruthlessly. Women were particularly vulnerable to false accusations. A woman who rejected a man's advances might find herself accused of theft out of spite. A woman who spoke too freely might be accused to shut her up. A woman who simply existed, in a way that made people uncomfortable, could be accused, convicted, and punished with minimal evidence. Records from England in the 1600s show numerous cases of women accused of stealing food or household items. The evidence was often laughably thin, she looked suspicious, or I saw her near my house. But suspicious looks and proximity were enough. The woman would be punished, usually with the pillory or branding, and her life would be effectively over. One case from 1687 involved a woman named Margaret who was accused of stealing a chicken. Her neighbour claimed Margaret had taken it, though she had no proof. Margaret explained she'd bought the chicken from a travelling peddler, but the peddler had moved on and couldn't be found to testify. The neighbour was believed. Margaret was branded. 6 months later, the neighbour's daughter admitted she'd eaten the chicken herself and feared punishment, so she blamed Margaret. By then, Margaret had already been branded. She'd already lost her job as a laundress. No one wanted a thief handling their clothes. She'd already been forced to leave her home. The correction of the record didn't undo any of that damage. The system was designed to punish quickly and visibly. It was not designed to determine truth. Those are fundamentally different goals, and medieval justice chose punishment over truth every single time. Children could be accused and punished too. The age of criminal responsibility was astonishingly low. A child of 7 could be hanged for theft in England. The logic was that if you were old enough to know right from wrong, you were old enough to be punished as an adult. In 1629, a boy named Thomas was hanged for stealing a loaf of bread. He was 8 years old. His family was starving. His father had died. His mother was ill. His siblings were hungry. He stole bread to feed them. The baker who caught him was within his rights to demand prosecution. The court was within its power to sentence death. The executioner was just doing his job when he placed the noose around a child's neck. Did the crowd feel bad watching an 8-year-old hang? Some probably did. But they'd also rationalise it. He knew it was wrong. His mother should have begged instead. We can't make exceptions or everyone will steal. The system ground forward, and a child died for the crime of hunger. The psychological impact of living in such a system extended far beyond the direct victims. Everyone lived with the knowledge that accusation could equal conviction, that no one was truly safe. The wealthy had more protection, but even they could fall victim to false accusations from those with more power. This created a society of intense paranoia. You watched your neighbours constantly, both to ensure they weren't stealing from you and to ensure you weren't accused of stealing from them. You avoided situations that could be misconstrued. You kept detailed records of every transaction, every movement, every interaction, because you never knew when you might need to prove your innocence. And yet, for all this fear, for all this brutal punishment, theft continued. Because people were desperate. Because the alternative to stealing might be watching your children starve. Because some people are criminals regardless of punishment. The hand press didn't eliminate theft. It just made the consequences of getting caught, whether guilty or innocent, absolutely catastrophic. The hand presses sit in museums now, behind thick glass with little placards explaining their historical context. Tourists take photos, make uncomfortable jokes, move on to the next exhibit. The iron has rusted. The screw mechanisms have frozen with age. They're artifacts, curiosities, reminders of a brutal past we've supposedly evolved beyond. But for the people who felt that screw turn, who heard their own bones crack, who spent the rest of their shortened lives unable to perform the most basic human tasks, for them, that device was the entire world. It was the moment their life split into before and after. Before the press, they had hope, possibility, a future. After the press, they had only survival. And for those who were innocent, who were crushed for crimes they didn't commit, the psychological damage went even deeper. The physical pain would eventually diminish to a chronic ache. But the knowledge that you'd been punished unjustly, that no one believed you, that your life was destroyed because someone lied or made a mistake, that pain never faded. Medieval Europe was a brutal place, but it was brutal with purpose. Every punishment served multiple functions: retribution, deterrence, entertainment, social cohesion. The hand press embodied all of these. One device, one simple mechanical principle, deployed to maintain order in a world always teetering on the edge of chaos. But the order it maintained was itself unjust. It protected the wealthy more than the poor. It valued speed over accuracy. It demanded blood and broken bones as the price of social stability. And it crushed countless innocent people in the process, sacrificing them on the altar of justice while calling it righteousness. The screams from town squares have faded. The executioners and their victims are long dead. But the principle remains: make crime costly enough, painful enough, public enough, and people will think twice. Whether that's justice or simply terror depends on which side of the iron plates you're standing. History will judge us the same way we judge our medieval ancestors. They thought they were civilized. They thought their system was just. They were absolutely certain that harsh, public, physical punishment was the only way to maintain order. They never questioned whether crushing innocent people's hands might undermine the very justice they claimed to serve. Let's hope future generations judge us more kindly than we judge them. Let's hope we're getting more right than they did, because the certainty with which medieval society applied its brutal justice is the same certainty we feel about our own systems today. And if history teaches us anything, it's that certainty and justice are not the same thing.